May I please request the chairperson, Ambassador Kesavapani, to first address everyone. Thank you, sir.
Good afternoon, friends. This is called the Death Watch session. Why? Because this is the most difficult session. After a good lunch, normally we go to sleep, and I hope you don't go to sleep. I'll just make one request. Let's be a bit more cozy, try and get together rather than far-flung. If you all can come together nearly, fill the tables. Number one. Number two, I wish the organizers had given us a larger room than this. We will feel even more comfortable. Let me start by saying a few things. What the session will not do is that we will not go back and look at the 1,000 years of our history, especially in the sphere of culture. Why? Because both the ministers this morning spoke extensively on the long culture that India has had. So the focus this one will be to look forward from now into the future. What will be the shape, form, and direction of Indian culture and the role that diaspora can play. Because I think there's enough literature, enough information to know about the past, but there is not enough information to know about the future. So these fine panelists or friends of mine are going to do that. They're going to fill in to look into the future. And I think you will agree that is more needed, much more needed than just going back to what Indian culture was 1,000 years ago. Now, to start off, I would like to introduce Mr. Prabhakar Nair, a friend of mine from Malaysia, and he is going to speak on the basis on which this discussion is going to be, and I will ask him to take the floor. And he also has a PowerPoint, so we're asking him to go first. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Let me start with some of the terms of reference. The subject of soft power involves the diaspora population as a strategic resource, not only for the source country, as is popularly regarded, but also the host country. Therefore, three parties are involved: the diaspora, two, the source or sending country, and third, the host or receiving country. In dealing with the diaspora, the source country must understand two important points. One, that the diaspora is not the same in different parts of the world, and two, that there is a difference in the way host countries look at the question of integration. Now, speaking of the diaspora context, the source country needs to know whether the Indian diaspora refers to the citizens of the host country or whether they are non-resident Indians. They need to know whether the diaspora consists largely of one ethnic group, as in the case of Malaysia and Singapore. The source country needs to know whether the diaspora is able to retain its cultural identity in the country of adoption. In some countries, this is not the case. The source country also needs to know whether the host government supports and promotes the language and culture of the diaspora. They also need to know if the diaspora is just a minority presence of Indian citizens who are already well adjusted in these societies. According to popular opinion, there is less problem dealing with the NRIs as it does not relate to the thorny issue of identity. Now let us look at the diasporic context of Malaysia. This is where I come from, and also His Excellency. Malaysia has the second largest Indian diaspora in the world, next to the United States, and of course followed by Burma. And the government recognizes Tamil as representing the Indian diaspora in Malaysia. They constitute 80%, the Tamils constitute 80% of the Indian diaspora in Malaysia, although they are just only 6% of the Indian population. So, in other words, the source country, India, faces the challenge of straddling the middle path in maintaining the best interests of the various Indian ethnic communities in Malaysia. It has also to be understood that the Indians in Malaysia have historical ties with both India and Malaysia as freedom fighters. They have fought for Indian independence, and they have also negotiated for the independence of Malaya. Another important point to remember is that the diaspora maintains regular contact with the country of origin in terms of active people-to-people contact. Speaking of integration, now we come to the subject of integration. There are two broad policies adopted by a number of countries. One is the policy of unity in diversity, which involves balancing dual cultural identities. And two, a policy of assimilation, whereby the diaspora is absorbed into the culture of adoption. When speaking of integration, there is a conflict regarding diversity as a human rights issue and diversity as an identity issue. Now, even in Europe, which emphasizes human rights, the dominant discourse now is on the issue of identity. We have to remember that. We can't always keep on talking about human rights and forget that identity issue is equally as important. Now, the urgent issue at hand is this, that we need bridge builders. We need bridge builders to ensure the harmonious coexistence of diaspora culture with the culture of the land. We need to avoid conflicts in areas such as maybe dressing styles, perceived show of deference, respect for elders, and so on. Promotion of language and culture is a two-way process. There's a need to promote one another's language and culture. As in the case of a migrant association, Chinese Migrant Association in Holland, which allocates its own funds to enable the Chinese diaspora to master the Dutch language. It is also important for the diaspora to be seen to be supporting local causes, such as helping with disaster relief, as an example. Building bridges also involves strengthening the bonds of the past. Between India and Malaysia, we have archaeological relics that reminds us of an ancient relationship. More recently, we have the example of our involvement in the struggle for Indian independence. We need to work towards a common vision in terms of highlighting the universal goals of issues such as human rights and sustainable development. Needless to say, there is a need to involve various racial groups in the activities of the cultural center, which is administered by the Indian government. There is a need to incorporate the participation of locals as dialogue partners in the decision-making process. This is very important. Involvement of locals in decision-making process. There is a need to advocate the right perspectives on culture and religion. It will do well for the source country to oppose fundamentalist values in culture and religion with perspectives that are noble, enlightened, and rational. The diaspora must be alerted to the dynamism of Indian culture which is always changing and evolving. There is also a need to emphasize common values that are universal. There is a need to organize celebrations of cultural and religious significance. Like in the case of Malaysia, the government organizes festivals on behalf of the ethnic communities as a matter of national policy. There are certain factors that are likely to work in India's favor in the task of helping the diaspora bridge the two worlds. Number one, India's position as an emergent superpower wields global influence which must be exercised in a subtle and judicious manner in the interests of the host country. Two, the forces of globalization and people's interests in wanting to discover their cultural and spiritual roots is also another factor that will work in India's favor in the task of helping the diaspora bridge the two worlds. India has the diaspora to aid its task. In countries like Malaysia, they are in a position to support India's noble vision of spreading the message of peace and mutual coexistence in the region and the world over. The accumulated wisdom of the ages has long prepared India for this challenge. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nair. You have raised a number of issues, a number of points to consider and ponder over. And the most important thing that coming out is that what can the diaspora do to spread Indian culture, and the reverse, what can India do, an emerging superpower, to help the diaspora in this project. So I think it's a two-way process which we'll have to form, and maybe at the end of it, we will find some solution. I now like to invite Ms. Anupama Shekhar. She's with the Asian Institute next to ISAS, and I would now like to ask her to, she's in charge of the culture section, Indian culture section there. Thank you very much. Anupama?
Thank you, Ambassador Kesavapani. Good afternoon, everyone. As Ambassador said, I work with an organization known as the Asia-Europe Foundation, where I'm in charge of the culture programs, and we connect over 50 countries in Asia and Europe through culture. So I think it's perfect to speak about cultural ties. What I'm going to try and do is pick up from what Mr. Nair has already said about cultural diplomacy and share with you some of my observations of the big changes in cultural diplomacy in the last decade, and how there is a slow and subtle shift from cultural diplomacy towards what is now called cultural cooperation. And I think this is critical in bridging the gap between India and its diaspora spread all over the world. What do I mean when I say there is a shift from cultural diplomacy to cultural cooperation? Of course, countries all across the world, including India, continue to do key cultural diplomacy initiatives. This is one of them. We are gathered here today to understand where India stands, what India wants, and how it's connecting to ASEAN. But I think we're slowly seeing a change from the show and tell diplomacy, just sending out our best films or our best artists, to also moving towards what is now called mutual cultural practice, collaborating, doing things together. And as we all know, doing things together is more difficult than just showing what we are already good at. And I think this slow and subtle shift from what is just a diplomatic initiative to a real cooperation initiative, I think this is where the strength of cultural cooperation lies. Because it's not anymore about self-promotion alone. It's also about values promotion, and it's also about, in an increasingly fragile and shrinking world, it's about mutual understanding. It's about understanding where we stand, what we aspire for, what others stand for, what they aspire for, and what is the common space in which we can meet. And not only meet, but also create together. And I think this is the future of international cultural cooperation, this meeting and creating together. And I think we're seeing a lot of evidence of this. For instance, co-production funds are all over the place now. It's a fantastic new trend for filmmakers, not just to make films at home and then show it at film festivals abroad, but to really work with diaspora artists somewhere far, far away from them and produce something new together. And as we all know with art, it's like going on a date. Some artists click, produce something spectacular, the results are fantastic. In other cases, you put people together, and at the Asia-Europe Foundation, we give grants for co-production. A year later, you just get back a reply saying, no, I didn't have good chemistry with Hansel, sorry, money is spent, but we have nothing to show. That's how culture works. Just by giving a money and giving them a brief, you will not get anything. I think you have to give people space to meet, space to test each other's energies, space to fail. And I think which is why when we talk about cultural cooperation and cultural exchange, very often the funder, the donor, the person who's putting up the money expects spectacular results. And I think one of the most important things in cultural exchange is to prepare to invest in the process and then pray. Sometimes you get spectacular films, spectacular music pieces. Other times, you don't get anything. But people have met, and 3-4 years later, they end up doing something together, and it's an investment in that process. And I think this is the shift from diplomacy towards cooperation. It's a difficult shift, but it's a shift nonetheless that's very interesting. And state actors, of course, governments do a lot, but we're also beginning to see that non-state actors, be they foundations, cultural networks, artists, artist collectives, professional associations of people who work in culture, they're beginning to play a very important role. So it's no longer only about our countries doing things. People have their own networks. They are producing things together, showing things together. And I think this is a fantastic new trend. What we will have to wait and see is to see, can governments and the artists work together? Can somehow foreign policy and cultural policy ever also accommodate artists' visions? It's a very tough thing. There are always integrity questions, censorship questions. So this is a big question, but I think there are new models of engagement where public and private sector are indeed working together. But for me, what's exciting is to see the rise of non-state actors in international cultural cooperation. People are simply out there connected, also through social media, and just doing interesting work. One other interesting trend that I see is, of course, we know that bilateral diplomacy or bilateral relationships between countries still remains the cornerstone of public diplomacy. Most countries have, their traditional allies, countries with which they do other things, particularly in culture. But we've also been slowly seeing in the last decade the move towards multilateralism. And I think today's event here, once again, also points in that direction. It's about India meeting ASEAN, which is 10 different countries, economies, cultures. So I think multilateralism is very interesting because you go beyond just a one-to-one connection. It's a one-to-many connections. And you also begin to make more unusual connections, regions, areas, peoples that you are not linked to in the past. And I think this multilateralism bodes well for the world. It's more exciting, there's more cultural diversity, and I'd like to cite the example of the foundation where I work. The Asia-Europe Foundation is publicly funded by 51 countries, as well as the ASEAN Secretariat. So we receive tax money from over 50 countries across the world, and one of our key areas is to promote cultural exchange, bringing together artists, cultural practitioners, museum professionals from across these 50 countries and get them to work together to collaborate and produce new things together. I think this kind of an investment, India has been supporting the foundation. Each of the ASEAN countries is a member of the foundation and contributes to it, and the ASEAN Secretariat itself is a member. And I think this kind of an investment by all these parties in what is a multilateral collective initiative is a very exciting model, because every project that we fund is funded through public money coming from all these countries. So again, see that multilateralism is the way to go. It's an interesting model for cultural cooperation going forward. And I would also say that for a long time, culture was about the arts. It's about music, it's about dance, it's about visual arts. But we've also seen in the last decade, with all the discussions around the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals, that there is very slowly but surely a recognition that culture is more than just the arts, that culture is a public good. We've also been hearing the discourse around the creative industries, that culture can actually yield jobs, it can support economic growth, it can support sustainable development of communities. And I think this also bodes very well for international cooperation, because it's also about connections between young creative entrepreneurs, between people who run social enterprises. So there's a whole new field out there for people to connect, to understand each other's models, and to work together. But having said that, I would also say that international cultural cooperation and strengthening cultural links still faces some barriers. I think there are still quite a bit of information gaps. We know bits and pieces about what's happening in India, what's happening elsewhere among Indian artists, but we're always looking for reliable, updated information on what's out there, and I think this still remains a problem. People are still wondering, how do I connect with person X? How do I find information about what's happening in the northeast of India? This is still a problem. And the second key problem is artists are still struggling to find money to travel. Because I think today artistic practice is very international. People work locally, of course, in their own regions, communities, but they also work internationally. And collaboration is essential dimension of their work. And it's still quite difficult for artists to get visas, to simply get the money to travel. And so I think cultural mobility still remains a critical area. And this is something I strongly feel that governments should support. The more we support people to meet, artists and creative people to meet, then they will do the rest. But the first step is the meeting, is the space to meet, is the money to buy your tickets, is the getting your visas. And I think here, again, public investment is critical, and this is something governments can do in order to then promote international cultural cooperation. So to sum up, I'll say that, yes, I think cultural diplomacy exists, but at the same time, there is also a parallel trend towards cultural cooperation, towards mutual cultural practice. And I think given our fragile and uncertain times, this is the space to be, to find common ground between artists who live and work in India and Indians elsewhere in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anupama. Cultural diplomacy is something close to my heart. Being a diplomat myself, having practiced it, I can say how vibrant it can be. I'll tell you a little story. This goes back to the 70s, late 70s, Tashkent, Uzbekistan. I'd gone into a restaurant to have just a drink. We were not allowed those days, to wander around, but I went into this restaurant, saw some, that time they were called Soviets, now they're called Uzbekis, and they asked me, where are you from? So it was a bit difficult to explain I'm from Singapore, so I said, I am Indian. Straight away, Raj Kapoor. And they started breaking into song. Can you imagine the power of diplomacy that goes as far as that? So cultural diplomacy is something not to be ignored. if you have economic diplomacy, you have military diplomacy. Cultural diplomacy can be as potent as the other forms of diplomacy. And India is by far the richest country in the world with the assets to promote cultural diplomacy. Sanskrit, the oldest language in the world. Religions, two or three out of the main religions today are from India. So at any form or shape you take, India has the assets. Now what is needed is to project and propel it into the 21st century. Now we have a very interesting person, one after all our hearts, Mr. Hansal Mehta. He is a filmmaker. And here comes the question, what part do films make in culture, in the whole gamut of culture? So may I ask Mr. Mehta to come and enlighten us. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for telling me what I should speak about. Because when I found out that, I was on this panel, I was a bit nervous. I said, there are policymakers, there are people who work on cultural diplomacy, cultural cooperation. And as a filmmaker, what do? I tell stories. And I think the part that we play in the larger culture, I've been making films over the past few years, which have traveled around the world. And through those films, through the stories that we tell, I realized that there is so much lack of understanding, the understanding of our culture as a stereotypical snake charmers nation, because of, a lack of exposure to our culture. As artists, we have failed our culture by not disseminating that culture in a much more global platform, talking about a culture in a language that is global. So, and culture, we don't, there's one section of culture, when we used to go to film festivals earlier, there was exotic India. So everything was about, reincarnation or poverty, about, extreme poverty, about snake charmers, elephants, animals. And over the past few years, the effort has been to tell you stories about the real India, about the real problems, the lack of cultural understanding within our own country, sharing that, creating a dialogue about that through our stories. So when I made a film called Shahid in 2012, it traveled around the world, and it was a story of a young Muslim boy, taking to radicalism and eventually retracting from that and becoming a champion for human rights. Now, this was a story, many people said, well, this is a very local story, this is a story about India. But the amount it traveled around the world and the way it resonated with a larger population also made me realize that how important this story was, how it resonated with the diaspora there, which often, it was not only in the Indian, Pakistani diaspora, everyone saw it and realized that, perhaps they were living in a time warp, that there was a way beyond what, they had, the bubble that they were living in. These stories helped them sort of get out of that bubble, helped them to introspect, helped them to reflect. So, as a filmmaker, we play a part in trying to create stories that help you reflect, reflect on. My previous film was about the Indian diaspora, a film called Simran. So many people, because we, in India, when we watch films about the diaspora, we have this very rosy picture that if you live in the United States, if you've settled there, you have this big mansion, and the sun, while you're praying, somebody, Lata Mangeshkar is singing a prayer, the sun lands in a private jet. And that is our impression of the diaspora. And suddenly, when you actually go there, you realize the diaspora has its own set of struggles, its own set, it has its stories, generational stories. So which we tried to project through our films. There are filmmakers who have tried to provide a realistic representation of the diaspora and the world that they live in. So as a filmmaker, all I can say is that we can tell more stories and help them, disseminate those stories in a wider platform. I think all I would like is that our stories are seen by a wider audience. They're seen beyond the diaspora. When we make films, we would like a larger audience to see them and gain a greater understanding of us and our evolving culture. We are not the culture that we were 300 years ago. We have evolved. And that evolved culture, the richness, our diversity, the way it has made us into an economic superpower, that evolution is something that the world needs to see through our stories. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we are beginning to see India using films as a form of projecting. That's why all over the world now, Singapore, Malaysia, Dubai, you have these film festivals which are becoming very popular, and they project the kind of culture that we would like to see and we would like to have. And I'm sure also in Singapore we are also beginning to have rudiments of Indian filmmaking. There's recently one, Chennai to Singapore to Chennai, or Chennai to Sim. It was quite an interesting filmlet, so to speak. So this is a budding area that our people interested in culture should try and expand. Now let me come to the last, my good friend, Venkat, and we have known each other for some time, and he's with the La Salle School of Arts. He teaches, he promotes, he brings out new ideas, and so let's see what new ideas he has got now.
Thank you, Your Excellency. First of all, I'm absolutely thrilled to be here, and I'd like to thank the Indian High Commission of Singapore for inviting me to be part of this particular panel. So, like His Excellency said, that I do come from an art school, I come from an arts college, and I primarily train artists, and that's what I do, and I have absolute thrill in training a new generation of artists for the 21st century. So I'm also very pleased to note the fact that we produce some of the award-winning artists, and we also produce some of the best troublemakers. All right, and that's what artists do, because they are always unconventional. Unconventional in the sense that they are continuously going to be explorers of the world. They're going to be searching for new languages that will help them determine what it means to make sense of who they are in this particular world. And also to look at what is the sense of where they are located and what is their point of view about the world from where they stand. It is not where they are, all right? And that's a very important part of it. So we all are being told continuously that we are in a very challenged world, a world that's disruptive, volatile, populist, a whole set of issues are around the world. But when has the world ever been faultlessly sane? It has never been. It has always been determined by migration. It's always been determined by a cause and effect modality of looking at the world. The difference is today, in the last 10, 20 years or so, we have a notion of what we call instantaneity. Through technology, we are getting much more information that are quickly allowing us to respond to situations as they come along. And that's an important part of our consideration of how we look at the concept of training our artists. We also have to acknowledge the fact that we've got a rising middle class, a rising youth population, and the cooperation that Anupama talked about that's increasingly becoming critical in connecting societies, communities, and individuals. Coming from Southeast Asia itself has close to 625 million people, and averaging an age of 24. It is one of the most highly digitally penetrated economies in the world, and in a recent survey, they found that close to $60 billion worth of digital animation works are emerging out of Southeast Asia. And that's the consumptive market that's actually operating here. So clearly there is a divide between how we look at the world of relationship between Southeast Asia or India, or for the matter, any of its key major allies. But the fact is, much of Southeast Asia has been historically been defined by colonial or cultural policy or economic policy, but not so much by cultural policy. And that's an important kind of a consideration where at the people-to-people level, it has always been about culture that has driven the connectivity through tradition, through religion, through activities that are necessarily social, that brings people together. So one of the things that I've been very interested in is, I come from an environment where I'm training young people between the ages of 16 to 25 on average, whose ability to engage with new media, new technology, but who might not necessarily want to engage with a romanticized idea of what Southeast Asia or Asia is. And how do you start to give voice to the contemporaneity of the present at that moment in time? And so in training artists, we are looking at artists as leaders themselves. And they're leaders in being able to project out to the world. What does it mean to have a stake in the future by having a point of view about the future? And that's very important by having a point of view. For us, in an art school environment, cultural leadership is not an academic skill. It is about learning to stand alone and bringing others along and finding common cause and purpose within and outside of the structures that are there in order to define how the world is to you and how do you flourish. So in an educational environment, I often quip, much to the chagrin of my academic colleagues, that many of us are 20th century trained people training the 21st century learners. And many of them are going to be writing their own textbooks and are going to be the scribes of their century. So what do we have but to offer them? I think an open mind is what we need to offer them, so that they are able to negotiate and navigate through the multiplicity of complexities and sophistications that are being thrown at them, because the world is still going through a cathartic moment of late 20th century. It is still kind of getting itself out of that system. So the question I have is, more importantly, what kinds of initiatives should we look at to facilitate cultural exchange between the youth? And I'm here talking about people below the age of 35 and below, to explore emerging technologies, new cultural and creative industries between ASEAN and India, outside of the kind of the romanticized worldview of that relationship, like Hansel and His Excellency had mentioned. So I put forward this suggestion, like Anupama had suggested some opportunities for cooperation. I think it's important to bring about a forum for people between the ages of literally 16 to 25 into a cultural leadership forum to look at what kinds of inquiries are important to them. What are the questions that are defining who they are as young people, because many of them are technologically very well connected, more so than many of us are. Many of them are able to think through some of these initiatives through a policy dimension, where whether it is about preservation or it's about heritage, through new technologies, they will be able to respond to how to sustain a practice, a culture, and a community. I think the second suggestion I do have is, how do we engage with universities and colleges to really propel youth to determine their agenda of cultural sustainability? And I think that's a very important imposition. We take culture for granted, but culture is hard work. It is about sustaining a way of thinking, a way of life, and continuously nurturing it so that it shifts to the community at that particular moment in time in history. So it is important that, particularly in higher education, a cultural agenda needs to be in place. And universities need to start to see themselves as centers of culture rather than centers of just education. And this is very important. And I think Singapore is well placed to kind of negotiate and navigate through this kind of a bilateral relationship between India and ASEAN. I'm also very mindful that I do not want to look at ASEAN as just one concomitant bloc that we just engage with, but it's a multiplicity and diversity of communities and cultures that are so enriched by history and yet beleaguered by contemporaneity, that we need to find ways to necessarily engage with each and every one of them from their respective purposes. So to give you a simple example, you could look at the kind of history that, say, Cambodia emerges from, a post-conflict era, and how do they look at culture to bridge the new generation to a post-conflict world, and how do we create that, and how can we, both, say, Singapore and India can contribute to enhancing those opportunities there. So there are many ways that culture can really play a part in actually contributing to development of the youth in thinking through what kind of world that they want for themselves for the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think when we talk about youth, we also have to bring in the social media, because nobody uses the social media as well as the youth. And what is the connection you found in working with the youth?
I think the important thing is the social media is almost an extension of who they are, right? It's not just a communication tool. It's not just a communication to one person to another person, but it's necessarily an extension of who they are. And because it's an extension of who they are, we should not fear it, but embrace it as simple as. Today, you wake up in the morning, you do not go out and brush your teeth or have a cup of coffee. You check your mobile phone to see what messages you've got. It is an extension of who you are. All right? And because it's an extension of who you are, we need to make sure that is embedded in our everyday lives through education, through activities that we do, and even looking at preservation of culture through technology, right? Through documentation, through archival material, and through communicating that globally. So I think technology should be an enabler on many levels. And for the young people, in my experience, I've seen it's like fish to water. All right, so let's not fight it. Let's embrace it and make it an agenda in our cultural policies. That technology is not an agenda to be attracted to deal with, but it's already embedded throughout all forms of agendas as an integral part of its complexity.
Thank you very much for those broad strokes. Now I'll open the floor. Anybody has any specific questions? Yes, please. 1, 2.
Thank you, Chairman, and other panels. I'm R.K. Ramani Krishna from Malaysia. My concern and question is how the Indian community, as the minority community in many Asian countries, facing the challenges to sustain and retain cultural language identities. And what are the advantages and disadvantages of multicultural and multi-language identity in the context of Asian Indian diaspora? Thank you.
You get the question. Could you just repeat that question so that...
How the minority community, like other than India and many Asian countries, Indians are minority, how they sustain and retain their cultural identity and language? First question. The second is, what are the advantages and disadvantages of the multicultural, like Indians, we reach with many language and many cultural identity in the context of Asian Indian diaspora? That is my question.
Anupama, would you? No?
I don't see multiculturalism as a problem at all. I think that they should be exposed to as many cultures as possible. And this is an asset. Like in Malaysia, for example, you have various cultural traditions. I think that is an opportunity, actually. It is not a problem. Opportunity for mutual exchange of cultural values across the racial and ethnic divide. And it is also a chance an opportunity for you to promote your culture across the ethnic divide. I don't see it as a problem. That is the direction to go, actually. Most of us, the problem arises when we look at culture as something which is ossified, rigid, and non-dynamic. We should look at culture as something that is evolving, something that is dynamic. So I think we should not be unduly worried about love of culture, in a very rigid form, because culture itself is something which is very dynamic and evolving.
Okay. But there is a practical problem, especially in a society like Singapore, where a lot of intermarriages take place. At that point in time, whose culture does the child follow? This is a very, very practical and real problem. So how do you solve it? Sometimes, of course, mother is the fount of all things at home. Whether the boy or girl follows the mother's side or the girl's. Or in Singapore, we call a term called Chindian. Chindian means half and half. So this is, but maybe because we can all go under the umbrella of multiculturalism. But this is a real problem in Singapore. I won't say problem, this is something that parents have to contend with. Sir, here's Prof after that. Please.
Hi, my name is Manish Maheshwari. My question is for Ms. Anupama Shekhar. India's cultural imprint in Southeast Asia is visible in so many things, right from names, food, clothing, cultural practices. One area where it is very, very visible is in museums. And on a business visit to Jakarta, I just happened to stay over the weekend and went to the National Museum in Jakarta. It was almost like going inside an Indian museum. It doesn't look like anything outside India. So my question is, between the link between Asia, India, and Europe, do you see possibilities or past experiences of joint exhibitions that can bring the cultural links together to people in a very visible fashion, right in front of them?
Let me quote something from Gurudev Rabindranath Tagore. He visited Bali and Java, and this is what he said. I see India everywhere, but cannot recognize it. Because what has happened, say you go to Bali, you go into the Hindu temples, the gods are not the gods that we can recognize. They are completely different. But they are more Hindu than us. They observe traditions more than us. So, and in the field of culture, the Japanese are more Indian culture. You will find more Indian, in Sanskrit Indian words on buildings than sometimes even in other parts. So it's called a sort of assimilation of culture. That's what I could think. Prof, you're the last question, I'm told.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Keshapani. My name is Shubrata Mitra. I'm the director of ISAS, Institute of South Asian Studies. Ambassador, it's a privilege for us to have you with us because you are simultaneously a deeply cultured person and a very successful diplomat. You can help us because the panel has reminded us how important culture is. If you ask two major questions, who am I, where do I belong? The answer, Indian culture, that's what binds us together. It's well known. Saying more of it is preaching to the converted. My argument would be to say that culture matters is fine, but to say that purveying Ayurveda or yoga as an instrument of cultural diplomacy is probably pointing in the wrong direction. Because India is not the only game in town. In Southeast Asia, India is competing against China. And China's answer to diplomacy is not culture, but cash. Now, the members of the diaspora did not leave India looking for culture, they left looking for cash and opportunities. So cash matters. And the second point would be, let's face it, Indians in Southeast Asian states are minorities. The more you emphasize Indian culture, the more you emphasize their distance from the local majority culture. The more India reaches out to the Indian minorities as an element of diplomacy, the more India becomes a little questionable. Now that was the problem that Jawaharlal Nehru had, which is why he was not so keen. Now, my question would be, is there a way to find that missing link in the bridge that we saw, where one could think in terms of transcultural citizenship, where one can be as Singaporean as one wants to be without having to deny one's Indian origin? Now, Indian constitution has found a method, which is why in India you don't have a majority or a minority, you just have different cultures. Indian constitution gives the right to vote to individuals, but it also recognizes group rights. If you are a Muslim or you are a Tamil in Delhi, you can have a school where Tamil or Urdu can be a medium of instruction and you'll get a grant from the state. So India has discovered the essence of transcultural citizenship. My entreaty to the panel would be to think about citizenship in terms of transcultural citizenship, and my recommendation to the Indian state would be not to forget cash, much as we pervade culture. Thank you.
Anybody comment? We take that as a comment. A very, very, very useful, but it'll take us half a day to really get to answer you. But unless you have anything specific, the panelists will be happy to answer. Okay. Let me end with 2 or 3 takeaways. You know, every session must end with a takeaway. I'm very sad because one of the panelists, Mrs. Riva Ganguly Das, was supposed to be with us. I very much wanted her to be with us because I wanted to tell her she's from ICCR, Indian Council for Cultural Relations. Number 1, can India evolve just like the Chinese have evolved one road, one belt? Can India evolve a cultural belt connecting India to right? It takes money, it takes effort, and ICCR is well poised to do that. Second, can we acknowledge that there is also reverse culture? Meaning, we have been receiving culture all these centuries, but now we are in a position to send back culture to India. And this is something that, at the coming National Republic Day, one of our groups is going to perform in India for the 10 ASEAN ministers. So this is what I mean by reverse culture. So there are quite a few things that we can do, and we hope ICCR will take the lead in promoting this two-way culture and an equivalent to the Chinese oboe. We can have an Indian oboe, so to speak of. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was our lovely panel of speakers, and I just want to talk about a few words which we definitely will always remember taking away from here. Telling stories. We all feel that we're doing our little bit, but yes, that little bit goes a long way. There's telling stories, which leads to internationally acceptance of our culture. There's cultural diplomacy we spoke about. There's building bridges. Yes, we all are building bridges while we're away from our countries. And at the same time, we talked about unconventional troublemakers and cultural leadership, which gels to my next topic, actually, that we're going to have in this room very shortly, talking about how to make sure that the youth across different countries from India become a part and stay a part of India. But apart from that, I just want to end this session with a word that says, your culture is your brand, and we all know how important brand is for us. While the beauty of the world lies in the diversity of the people, we must always remember that we all smile, and it has only one culture. we smile in the same language. With that, thank you so much. I would like to thank the panel that we have here. Chairperson, Ambassador Kesavapani, thank you very much. Mr. Hansal Mehta, Mr. Venka Purushothaman, Mr. Prabhakaran Nair, and Ms. Anupama Shekhar. Thank you so much for sharing your insights today.